My girlfriend Emily and I had decided to spend a weekend exploring the wilderness around Lake Tahoma, a secluded and picturesque spot nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It was the kind of place where you could truly disconnect from the hustle and bustle of daily life, surrounded by nothing but the serene beauty of nature. We were both avid hikers and loved seeking out new, unexplored trails that promised adventure and a break from our routine. That particular Saturday, we set off in my old Jeep Cherokee, driving down a narrow dirt road that wound alongside the shimmering lake on one side and the towering mountains on the other. The sun was shining, and the sky was a brilliant blue, making the journey feel like the beginning of a perfect day. The road was rough, with potholes and ruts that made the ride bumpy, but the scenery more than made up for it. The lake's surface reflected the sky like a mirror, and the mountains rose majestically in the distance, their peaks still dusted with the remnants of winter snow. As we ventured further, the dirt road gradually narrowed into a trail and eventually was swallowed up entirely by the encroaching forest. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead that filtered the sunlight into a dappled pattern on the ground. It felt like we were entering another world, one untouched by the modern age. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. Once the path became impassable by car, we parked the Jeep and set out on foot. The trail was rough and overgrown, but it had a wild beauty that captivated us both. We hiked for hours, losing ourselves in the tranquility of the forest. We marveled at the ancient trees, some of them so large it would take several people holding hands to encircle them. We stumbled upon a crystal-clear stream and followed it for a while, delighting in the sight of small fish darting in the water and the occasional deer that would pause to drink before bounding away at our approach. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. We realized it was time to start making our way back to the car before it got too dark. The hike back felt longer than the hike out, our legs growing weary and our stomachs beginning to rumble with hunger. The forest, which had felt so inviting and friendly in the daylight, started to take on a more ominous tone as the light faded. When we finally reached the Jeep, the sun was just a sliver on the horizon, and the sky was painted with hues of pink and orange. It was a challenge getting the car turned around on the narrow trail, but I finally managed it after several attempts, and we were off. The drive back was slow and tense, the road now seeming even rougher in the dim light. The headlights of the Jeep cast eerie shadows on the trees, making them look like giant, looming figures. Suddenly, we came to a fork in the path that hadn't been visible coming the other way. Neither of us had any idea whether to go right or left, and the growing darkness made the decision even more difficult. After a moment of hesitation, I chose the left path, hoping it would lead us back to the main road. The trail wound through the forest, and as we rounded a small curve, our headlights fell upon a startling sight. There, just ahead of us, was a man dragging a large hockey duffel bag off the trail and into the woods. He was dressed in ragged clothing, and his hair was long and unkempt, giving him a wild, almost feral appearance. As soon as the headlights hit him, he froze completely still, like a deer caught in the beams. The sight sent a chill down my spine, and I could feel Emily tense up beside me. Driving past him felt like an eternity because we couldn't have been doing more than 5 miles an hour due to the condition of the road. The man's eyes followed us as we crept by, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The bag he was dragging looked heavy and bulky, and my mind raced with dark possibilities about what might be inside. Emily and I didn't say a word to each other until we were well past him, our hearts pounding in our chests. "What the hell was that?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my own fear in check. "But I don't like it." We continued down the path, but it wasn't long before we reached a dead end. The forest had swallowed up this part of the road entirely, leaving us with no choice but to turn around. My stomach dropped at the realization that we would have to drive past the man with the duffel bag again. I took a deep breath and turned the Jeep around as quickly as I could, telling Emily to buckle up and hold on tight. At the first sign of trouble, "I'm gunning it," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. As we approached the spot where we had seen the man, I slowed down, my eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement. But he was nowhere to be seen. The duffel bag was gone, and the forest was eerily silent. We drove past the spot quickly, the tension in the car palpable. It wasn't until we were well down the road that we began to relax, but the questions lingered in our minds. How had he gotten there? What was in the bag? And where had he gone? Eventually, we found the right path and made our way back to the main road. The relief of being back on a familiar route was immense, but the strange encounter left a lasting impression on both of us. We couldn't stop talking about it, replaying the scene in our minds and speculating about what might have been happening in those woods. When I was younger, I volunteered for the search and rescue team in the small, picturesque town of Timberline, nestled in the heart of the Rocky Mountains. Timberline was a quaint place where everyone knew everyone, and the sense of community was as strong as the scent of pine in the air. Growing up surrounded by nature, I was a hiker by heart. The trails, the ridges, the valleys, they were my second home. So, when I heard about the search and rescue team, it felt only natural to lend my time and knowledge of the local terrain to help others. Our town wasn't notorious for high-profile missing person cases. Most of our missions were fairly routine. Lost hikers who had strayed off the beaten path, tourists who underestimated the ruggedness of the mountains, or occasional adventurers who found themselves injured and unable to make it back to civilization. These missions were most frequent in the late summer and fall, when the weather was still inviting but the days grew shorter. It was during one crisp autumn evening that I received a call that would forever be etched in my memory. The call came in around dusk. A man named Jake, who had been hiking with a group, had gone missing. His friends had returned from their hike, realized he was nowhere to be found, and immediately alerted the authorities. Instead of searching for him themselves, they did the smart thing and called for help. In situations like these, time was of the essence. The quicker we could mobilize, the higher the chances of finding the person safe and sound. Volunteers like me were called upon for these swift turnarounds, and we were always ready to spring into action. The search and rescue team was a well-oiled machine, and on that particular evening, we were divided into groups of 4, each led by a seasoned park ranger. My team was led by Ranger Tom, a grizzled veteran with a heart of gold and a steely determination that made him the perfect leader for such missions. Alongside me were Paul, a fellow volunteer with an uncanny knack for finding lost hikers, and Sarah, a nurse who volunteered to provide medical assistance whenever needed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape, we began our search. Our designated area was a sloping ridge that led up to a plateau, a terrain I knew well. The ridge was notorious for its switchbacks and steep inclines, often misleading hikers into thinking they were on a gentle slope when in reality, it was anything but. Equipped with walkie-talkies, flashlights, and an unwavering resolve, we spread out in a standard grid search pattern. The air was cool, with a slight breeze rustling the leaves, and the only sounds were our footsteps and the distant chirping of crickets. The occasional chatter on the walkie-talkies provided updates from other teams scattered throughout the canyon. It was a surreal sight. Beams of light cutting through the darkness, bobbing up and down as searchers moved through the wilderness, all united in the singular goal of finding Jake. The grid search was methodical, each step taken with purpose. The ridge was challenging, with loose rocks and dense underbrush making every step a calculated risk. Despite the difficulty, we were confident. Our team had a hunch that Jake was somewhere in our section of the grid. The terrain was familiar, and the sounds of the wilderness guided us. Periodically, we would stop, listen, and shout Jake's name, hoping for a response. Once, we thought we heard a faint reply, but it was quickly drowned out by the rustling leaves and the distant echoes of other searchers. As we reached the plateau, the landscape changed dramatically. The flat expanse was a stark contrast to the treacherous climb, offering a false sense of security. At 7,000 feet elevation, the view was breathtaking, but we had little time to admire it. Our focus was on the task at hand. We could hear something moving in the brush periodically, an unsettling sound that kept us on edge. Animals would have long since fled at the noise we were making, so whatever was out there had to be human. Then, the radio buzzed with chatter. A team across the canyon had found Jake. He was safe, albeit a bit shaken, and was being escorted back to the command post. Relief washed over us, but there was also a tinge of disappointment. We had hyped ourselves up, convinced we would be the ones to find him. Plus, there was still the matter of the mysterious noises in the trees. We lingered on the ridge, scanning the tree line with our flashlights, listening intently for any sign of movement. The eerie silence was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. After about 10 minutes, we began our descent back to the trailhead, where the command post was set up. The trek down was quicker, driven by the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. As we reached the halfway point, we noticed a light much closer to us, maybe just a few hundred yards down the face. It was eerily bright, standing out starkly against the dark backdrop of the forest. One of the other volunteers suggested it might be another team lagging behind, but the park ranger quickly radioed in to confirm. The response was clear. No other teams were near our position. The light continued to puzzle us. It seemed too bright and stationary to be a simple campfire or flashlight. Just as we began to descend again, the light abruptly vanished. No flicker, no fade, just gone. The sudden disappearance left us rattled. Even the park ranger, a man who had seen it all, seemed unnerved. Determined to get to the bottom of it, we descended cautiously, lights trained on the area where the mysterious glow had been. But there was nothing, no signs of a fire, no tracks, no evidence of any kind. The feeling of dread was almost tangible. We were all eager to get off the mountain, our earlier enthusiasm replaced by a sense of urgency. As we neared the bottom, I found myself walking alongside Paul. We were discussing the strange events of the night, the mysterious light, the unsettling noises, the eerie silence. Paul, always want to come up with wild theories, suggested everything from human traffickers to Bigfoot to UFOs. I found his ideas amusing, but there was no denying the unsettling nature of our experience. Suddenly, a loud sound emanated from the tree line to our left. We froze, hearts pounding, as we tried to locate the source. The noise was close, too close. Then, we heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it was almost drowned out by the rustling leaves. "Hey," it said. Paul and I exchanged glances, a mix of fear and curiosity in our eyes. Who would be whispering in the middle of the night, miles from civilization? We turned towards the trees, straining our eyes in the darkness. And that's when Paul saw it, a figure crawling on the forest floor, moving quickly towards us. Paul yelped and stumbled backward, his flashlight cutting erratic beams through the trees. I rushed to his side, helping him to his feet just as Ranger Tom and Sarah arrived, guns drawn. Paul, still shaken, described what he had seen. A person, naked and covered in dirt, crawling towards him with eyes reflecting the light. We did a thorough sweep of the area, calling out, but found no trace of anyone. The experience left us all unnerved, the earlier feeling of dread now magnified. We hurried back to the command post, eager to put the night's events behind us. Once there, we made our report, but the mystery remained unsolved. No other missing persons were reported that night, and the strange light and figure were never seen again. That night on the mountain left an indelible mark on me. The wilderness, which had always been a place of solace and adventure, now held an element of the unknown, a reminder of the mysteries that lurk just beyond the edges of our understanding. The experience brought our team closer, bonded by the shared encounter and the unspoken agreement that some things in this world simply cannot be explained. Several years ago, I found myself weaving through the bustling streets of Midtown Atlanta, making my way home from my office in the financial district. I worked in a sleek, modern building just a block away from Peachtree Street. It was late 2011, around the time the Occupy Wall Street movement had morphed into Occupy Atlanta, with protests in Woodruff Park. The streets were a sea of people, backpacks slung over shoulders, headphones on, and many carrying signs and megaphones. Navigating the narrow sidewalks was a challenge, and it was nearly impossible not to bump into someone. The hassle, though, was nothing out of the ordinary for me. I had my earbuds in, music playing to drown out the cacophony of the city. It was my usual routine, a little bubble of peace amidst the chaos. As a lifelong Atlantan, I was used to crowded streets and the constant hum of the city. But to get to the subway and back home to Decatur, I had to either circumvent or cut straight through Woodruff Park, which had become more than a minor annoyance over the past few weeks. The protest had brought an influx of people to the area, and the usually bustling streets were now choked with even more bodies. Still, crowded streets were a fact of life. The same could be said for the numerous homeless people who found refuge in the city's many nooks and crannies. I'm no saint, but I tried to drop a bit of spare change into their cups whenever I could. It wasn't every time, but I did what I could. Yet, I was ashamed to admit that sometimes I was in such a rush that I didn't even notice them. I guess that made me no different from those who breezed past without a second glance. Often, it seemed as if the homeless were an invisible part of the city, living on the scraps left by those more fortunate. One particular afternoon, as the protests swelled and the park became too crowded to traverse, I decided to take a different route to the subway. I chose a quieter, less busy side street, hoping to find some semblance of peace. The moment I stepped onto that street, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, plunging my previously decent mood into darkness. The feeling was inexplicable, so I pulled out my earbuds, needing my senses to be sharp for whatever danger I was sensing. As I tucked my earbuds into my coat pocket, a pungent odor assaulted my nose. It was the unmistakable stench of someone who had been living on the streets for a long time. Ahead, near the corner of a building, I saw a surprisingly young man in torn jeans and a hoodie. His wild black hair and unkempt beard gave him a feral appearance. He rocked back and forth, a look of utter hopelessness etched onto his face. He clutched a small cardboard sign that read, "Help, please," Army vet. Lost everything. Just need $40 to get back home. There were few people on this street, but enough that he occasionally popped out from his corner, arms outstretched with the sign, begging for acknowledgement. It was a heartbreaking sight. I felt a pang of guilt, knowing I had nothing on me to spare. I would inevitably become one of those people who walked by without seeming to care. Just as I was grappling with this guilt, I saw an odd-looking man further down the road approaching the homeless guy. The stranger stopped in front of him and crouched down to his level. After a moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a large roll of cash, holding it out as if to offer it but hesitating. It was a bizarre sight, especially in Atlanta. At least I no longer felt guilty for being unable to help the poor guy. But things didn't unfold as one might expect. That's when everything took a surreal turn. I've been building up to this long preamble because thinking back to this event sends a shiver down my spine. As I walked closer, the world around me seemed to slow down. The usual city noises faded into a murmur, as if I were underwater. The closer I got, the more I focused on the stranger with the money. He looked ordinary, dressed like any other office worker. A simple brown suit hung loosely on his slender frame. He wore a tie, dress shoes, and carried a generic leather briefcase. A matching brown hat obscured the top half of his face. When I was just a few yards away, the man lifted his head to meet the homeless man's gaze. That's when I stopped dead in my tracks. His previously bland appearance took on a disturbing clarity. His skin was an unsettling ashen white, and his eyes were a deep, unnerving black. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was wearing black contacts, but it wasn't just his appearance that stopped me. It was the feeling he gave me, like a punch to the chest. It was worse than any panic attack I'd ever experienced. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move. The air around me seemed to solidify. In my peripheral vision, people moved in slow motion, oblivious to the horror I was witnessing. Gradually, the voices of the two men became clearer. The homeless man stuttered, "I don't want to die," as he reached for the money, eyes filled with fear. The stranger smiled, a chilling smile that made me want to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. "Oh, well, you're going to die either way, Robbie," the stranger said. The homeless man, Robbie, straightened up, his face a mix of amazement and horror. "From now on, I'll call the man in the brown suit Brown, as it makes it easier to tell the story." Just as Robbie was about to respond, Brown lifted his hands as if giving an important presentation. His voice was like oily gravel, wet and unpleasant. "Question is, do you want to die happy and comfortable, wanting nothing? Or do you want to die in this alley where no one will even notice until you've been rotting a while?" Suddenly, a third voice joined in. Another man, nearly identical to Brown but taller and thinner, wearing a gray suit, stepped into view. "I'll call him Gray." Gray held a lit cigarette and looked down at Robbie with tired indifference. "Take the money, Robert. We have things to do." Robbie, with a resigned expression, took the cash. "This is so much," he exclaimed as he clawed at the bills. I couldn't hear what was said next. Brown stood up, followed by Gray, and Robbie gathered his few possessions before thanking them and briskly walking past me, thanking God over and over, tears streaming down his face. I still couldn't move. As Robbie disappeared from view, the two strangers turned their gaze on me. Their black eyes made me feel like I was being watched by something inhuman. Their mouths moved, but I couldn't understand them. The noise around me fluctuated wildly, disorienting me. Eventually, I heard snippets of their conversation, but the language was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't just foreign. It was physically painful to listen to. like the pressure in your ears that won't go away. Brown snarled a word at Gray. English. Gray made a bizarre clicking noise and smiled that horrific smile. That far gone, huh? It'll be fine, Brown responded. Yeah? Then why'd you lie? Gray asked. What Brown said next haunts me to this day. Doesn't matter. I'll be wearing that stupid chimp by the next moon. He made more clicking noises, and my eyes welled with tears. The world began to return to normal speed, and I could see people walking by, oblivious to my terror. Gray looked directly at me. My head swam, and I felt dizzy. My vision blurred, focusing only on Gray's voice. Well now, look what this one can do. Cute. Brown stepped forward, his black eyes sneering inches from my face. Whatever. A chimp's a chimp. They're all the same. Hey, you. Chimp. Leave. Now. His snarl reverberated through me. Keep walking. The next thing I knew, I was standing on the sidewalk at Centennial Olympic Park, nearly a half-hour's walk from where I had been. A stranger held my shoulders, concern etched on his face. Yo, you all right, man? He asked, voice trembling. You almost walked into traffic. You okay? Someone else shouted, must be on drugs, as they hurried by. I assured the man I was fine, tears streaming down my face, and fled to the nearest subway station, my mind racing. When I got home, I realized I couldn't tell anyone, not even my wife. She'd think I was losing my mind. I haven't seen those strange men since that day. I thank God for that. Over the years, I've delved into the paranormal, trying to identify what they were, but I haven't found anything that matches their description. I've heard of black-eyed kids, and the vibes people get from them are similar, but these were grown men. I don't know what I saw, and it still haunts me. It was one of those warm summer nights where the air was thick with the promise of adventure. My friends and I, all around 16 years old and perpetually seeking thrills, decided it would be the perfect evening to hike to the top of a small mountain near our town. There was a meteor shower expected that night, and we thought it would be the coolest thing ever to watch it from the summit. There were 4 of us. Me, my best friend Jake, our buddy Chris, and Emily, the only girl in our group. Emily was tough and adventurous, never one to shy away from a challenge. We piled into Jake's beat-up old sedan and drove to the trailhead, the car filled with the kind of excited chatter that only comes from teenagers on the cusp of a new escapade. The drive was short but scenic, the road winding through dense forests and past serene lakes, all bathed in the silvery light of the full moon. We parked the car at the base of the trail and started our hike, flashlights in hand, but mostly relying on the moonlight to guide us. The forest was alive with the sounds of night. Crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustling of leaves as nocturnal creatures went about their business. About halfway up the trail, we decided to take a break. We found a flat rock and sat down, passing around a water bottle and catching our breath. It was then that we noticed something strange. There was a man following us, dressed in a business suit of all things. He was far enough away that we hadn't noticed him earlier, but now that we did, it sent a shiver down my spine. Who hikes in a suit at night? We exchanged uneasy glances. Do you guys see that? Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Yeah, Jake replied, his eyes narrowing. That's weird, right? Chris, always the practical one, suggested we keep moving. Let's just pick up the pace. Maybe he'll lose interest. We started hiking again, this time a bit faster. But every time we stopped to catch our breath, the man was still there, getting closer. By the time he was only about 10 feet away, our unease had turned to outright fear. We decided to stop and see if he would just walk past us. Instead, he stopped too, and with a casualness that belied the situation, asked if we were there for the meteor shower and if he could join us. We were taken aback. Here was a man in his 30s, in a suit, wanting to hike with a group of teenagers in the middle of the night. Everything about it screamed that something was off, but we were young and didn't want to appear rude, so we awkwardly agreed, hoping he would eventually leave us alone. As we continued up the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that was settling in my stomach. The man walked uncomfortably close to Emily, so close that he could probably smell her shampoo. Emily shot me a nervous glance, and I could see the fear in her eyes. My protective instincts kicked in, and I positioned myself between her and the man as much as I could. When we finally reached the top, the view was breathtaking. The sky was a blanket of stars, with the first few meteors streaking across in brilliant flashes of light. We spread out a blanket and sat down, trying to enjoy the show despite the strange company. The man, however, sat down almost right next to Emily, his presence a dark cloud over our little group. Emily was visibly uncomfortable, and I could tell she was scared. I leaned over and whispered to Jake, "We need to get out of here. Now." Jake nodded, understanding immediately. "Hey guys," he said aloud. "I just remembered I promised my mom we'd be back early. We should probably head back down." We all stood up, and the man followed suit. I felt a surge of panic. Would he follow us all the way back to the car? We started down the trail, this time moving quickly. The descent was treacherous in the dark, but adrenaline pushed us forward. The man kept pace with us for a while, but eventually he fell behind. Relief started to wash over us as we neared the bottom. But when we reached the car and looked back, we saw him. He was running, no, sprinting, down the trail towards us, and he had picked up a large stick along the way. My heart pounded in my chest as we scrambled into the car. "Go, go, go," Emily shouted, her voice shaking with fear. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling, but finally managed to start the engine. We sped off, leaving the man and his stick behind. We didn't stop driving until we were back in town, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, our bodies still buzzing with adrenaline. We parked in an empty lot and sat there in stunned silence for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" Chris finally said, breaking the silence. "I don't know," I replied, "but I'm glad we got out of there." We all agreed that the man must have been on some kind of drug or just out of his mind. We tried to laugh it off, but the fear lingered. We decided not to tell our parents, not wanting to worry them or get in trouble for being out so late. 2 days later, Emily sent us a link to a news report. A man had strangled his wife and then killed another girl on a hiking trail that same night. My blood ran cold as I read the article. The description of the man matched the stranger in the suit perfectly. We had come so close to becoming his next victims. We never went back to that trail again. The memory of that night stayed with us, a haunting reminder of how quickly a fun adventure can turn into a nightmare. It taught us to trust our instincts and be more cautious, especially in remote places. And every time I hear about a meteor shower or see a trailhead sign, I can't help but think of that man and wonder what might have happened if we hadn't left when we did. The experience left a lasting mark on us. For weeks, I had trouble sleeping, my mind replaying the events of that night over and over again. I kept thinking about how close we had come to real danger, how easily things could have gone differently. I felt a deep sense of gratitude that we had made it out unscathed, but also a nagging guilt for the girl who hadn't been so lucky. Emily and I talked about it often, trying to make sense of what had happened. She confessed that she had felt something was off from the moment we saw the man, but she hadn't wanted to say anything for fear of seeming paranoid. We both agreed that if we ever found ourselves in a similar situation again, we would listen to our instincts and act on them, no matter how irrational they might seem. It all happened about 2 years ago when I was 18. I had just discovered a deep passion for photography, and I loved immersing myself in community groups where we could explore and capture the beauty of nature together. Our group mainly consisted of adults in their 30s and 40s, along with their kids, making me one of the youngest members. Despite the age difference, I felt right at home among these folks who shared my enthusiasm for photography and the great outdoors. About 7 months into being a part of this group, a new member joined. He was fairly old, probably in his late 60s, and to be honest, he didn't look very appealing. He reminded me of a wrinklier Jack Nicholson, with wiry white hair and a disheveled appearance. Still, we welcomed him into our group chat, where he quickly expressed interest in joining our next hike. "Are we going out on another hike soon? I'd love to join you all," he had typed out. Our group leader, Mark, and I arranged the meeting place and time for the upcoming weekend. When Saturday rolled around, I was buzzing with excitement. We gathered at our usual spot, a quaint parking lot at the base of Forest Hill. The regulars were all there, chatting and preparing their gear. I looked around and asked if the new guy had shown up yet. The response was unanimous. No one had seen him. We waited for a good 25 minutes, but he never showed. Assuming he couldn't make it, we set off on our hike, eager to get some cool nature shots. The hike started out beautifully. The forest was alive with the vibrant colors of autumn, and the air was crisp and refreshing. We were halfway up the hill, deep in the woods, when suddenly, out of the bushes, emerged the new guy. His clothes were dirty, and he had a strange, silent demeanor. It immediately struck me as odd that he didn't have a camera with him, especially since it was a requirement for our activities. "I'll just tag along," he said, his voice low and unsettling. From the moment he joined us, an uneasy tension settled over the group. We were far from our cars, and the presence of this strange man in the middle of nowhere was making everyone uncomfortable. The usual chatter died down to wary whispers. Mark, our group leader, quietly whispered to me that we should circle back. I was relieved to hear that. This guy was creeping all of us out. Mark announced to the group that we were heading back, but just as we turned to leave, the man snapped. He started yelling at us like a madman, his voice echoing through the trees. "I'm going to skin you all alive and wear your skulls," he raved, pulling out a hunting knife strapped to his belt. My heart pounded in my chest as terror surged through me. Luckily, one of our members, James, was an ex-Navy officer. He sprang into action immediately. James, who was the muscle of the group, showed his worth as he tackled the man, twisting his arm behind his back in a move that clearly caused him pain. The man eventually calmed down, and we quickly made our way back to the parking lot, keeping a tight grip on our assailant. The entire way back, the man continued to spew vile threats, his eyes wild with rage. At one point, he bit the tip of his tongue off, causing blood to spill down his face. He let out a high-pitched, maniacal laugh, then fell silent. It was a sight straight out of a horror movie. Back at the parking lot, we called the police. We waited in tense silence as the man continued to glare at us, his face smeared with blood. When the police finally arrived, they took him away, much to our relief. The sergeant took our statements and assured us they would look into his background. A few days later, we received a chilling update. The police had discovered the man's real identity and where he lived. During their investigation, They found hundreds of photos of our group on his walls, taken during our hikes. He had managed to learn some of our names by eavesdropping on our conversations. The intentions of this man were pure evil, and it sent shivers down my spine to think about what could have happened. The aftermath of that terrifying encounter left me shaken. I couldn't stop thinking about how close we had come to a potential tragedy. It was a harsh reminder that even in the seemingly safe confines of our hobby, danger could lurk just around the corner. Our group had always felt like a safe haven, a place where we could share our passion for photography without fear. But that illusion had been shattered. For a while, I found it hard to join the group on their hikes. The memory of that man's crazed eyes and the blood dripping down his face haunted me. I would lie awake at night, replaying the events in my mind, wondering what would have happened if James hadn't been there to save us.